Welcome to the Learn By podcast. I'm Valentina.
And I'm René.
And together we talk about practical tips and tools for teachers around formative action and other effective pedagogy. We try to keep it short
and brief.
Anything we mention you can find in the show notes. Want to know more about what we do? Check out our website, formativeaction.com, where you can find our book, blogs, and online courses.
Welcome to the second episode of the Learn Bites podcast. And Valentina, I'm going to start off with a question. Let's say you're in my class and we're learning biology. And the lesson goal would be to draw a prokaryote cell, identify all of its organelles, and explain their functions. Would you know what to do?
No. I have no idea. What is a prokaryote? How do you write that?
How do you write prokaryote?
Yeah, I have prokaryote. I have no idea what it is. And I have no clue what to do either, or what I would be able to do after this lesson. I'm sorry.
Yes, I have news for you. Neither do I, but but you know, this might be a feeling maybe for you as a listener as well. As this might be a feeling a lot of students have in the classes when we present learning goals to them, is that they do not know what we're talking about. So in this episode, we're going to discuss a sense for quality, which is a very important strategy within formative action. And it's useful for helping students understand what a goal means and what the end point of a lesson or a series of lessons might be.
In this episode, we're going to discuss sense for quality. Firstly, we're going to discuss what is a sense for quality. Secondly, we're going to talk about why would you develop it. Thirdly, we're going to talk about how you can develop a sense for quality by comparing examples. Fourthly, we're going to talk about how you can use think alouds. And lastly, why criteria or rubrics are not necessarily useful to develop a sense for quality. So René, can you explain to the listeners what is a sense for quality?
Yes, a sense for quality is something that all experts have. It's something that they use to judge whether something is of high quality or not. But usually they'll have a more holistic approach to it. So they will look at something like a letter or a piece of art, or maybe even how somebody solved a mathematics problem, and make a judgment, quite a quick judgment on how it went. So and what the quality of it is, and if it is up to a certain standard. So usually when we have tasks or assignments, or we have to do something that requires like a complex skill or a higher order thinking skill, then we need to have a sense for quality in order to get it up to a certain standard, and also to monitor how we're doing. So as experts, we have lots of sense for quality, and students usually don't have a lot of sense for quality. So they are actually lacking like a very important skill in order to make the most use of lessons, to reach learning goals, to even understand what the learning goal is. So in our minds as teachers, when we say, well, you have to draw a prokaryote cell, we'll have like a picture in our head of what that is supposed to look like. But students don't have that. So they will have a fundamental problem in lessons. They don't know what we're trying to achieve. They don't know what steps to take to get there. And it's also useful in formative action, or one might say it's actually a prerequisite in order for formative action to function, is that students have a certain sense for quality. But because we have a lot of sense for quality as teachers, because we're experts in our subject, we tend to underestimate the value of it. And that's what's also called the curse of knowledge. So we have a curse of knowledge, which makes it hard for us to put us in the shoes of our students. And so I think sense for quality is also a forgotten strategy, where it's underutilized while it would be functional in lessons to do it more often. But the big question, of course, Valentina, is why would you develop a sense for quality?
Well, if you don't develop a sense for quality in your students, one thing you will notice is that students will constantly ask you questions or for directions like, what am I supposed to do now? Am I doing this right? Or is it now good enough? I think a lot of the listeners will recognize these kinds of questions, and they can be quite tiresome as well. So the first thing you will notice is when you develop a sense for qualities is that your students will become more self-regulated. So they will be better able to answer these questions for themselves because they have a better grasp or idea what is expected of them and what the end goal is and what it looks like or what the elements are of the end goal. And thirdly, when you develop a sense for quality, it also helps if you want to use feedback afterwards, because if students have a better idea of what's expected of them and what the end goal looks like, they can also place feedback better. They can understand it better because they know towards what goal the feedback is actually given.
Yeah, and one of the things we've noticed, because we give a lot of CPD and a sense for quality, is once teachers start to use it, they're actually flabbergasted by how much of a difference it makes. So you do get a lot less questions regarding, directional questions about what should I do next. They'll do a better job on their own accord. They also put like the standard of what they can achieve goes up. So they will do a lot better in terms of the final achievement that you're working towards. And what teachers also notice is that, for example, if you use peer feedback, then before you used sense for quality, they might talk about like nonsense stuff. They wouldn't give each other really good feedback. They'd just look at you and be like, do I think you're nice? And then they'll say something nice about your work. But after they have a sense for quality, they'll be way more critical towards each other, even more critical than you might have been if you had been the one giving the feedback. So usually once teachers try sense for quality, when they've never done it before and they start using it, they're absolutely sold on the entire thing because it makes such a difference in their classrooms. So the first approach to develop a sense for quality is comparing exemplars. Valentina, how does that work in practice?
Well, so as you just said, the whole idea is that students have to look at different exemplars of the end product. And for you as a teacher, the first thing you have to do is really think well about what kind of examples you want to show. So let's say, for example, you want your students to be able to write a letter. Then you have to collect some different examples that really make a good exemplar. So you have to have a good example of what good work looks like. So a good example of a good letter, but maybe also a letter that is more of a medium level, and also one that it's not really so good at all. Because then if students have to, that's the second thing you have to do, students have to compare the different examples or exemplars, is that they will get in that way a better grasp of what quality looks like and also what the elements are. Because if you have to compare it, then you get a better feeling, and it's also it comes to life in a way. You really see like, oh, if I forget that, or if I miss out on this or that element, then I see now that the letter is not so good, or it's not so easy to read through the letter, or it's not so clear. And we can, of course, as teachers try to explain that, and that also helps. But when students have to really compare the different examples, it is so much more powerful, because then they really see for themselves and they discover for themselves also the impact of if something's really good or if something is missing out or is missing or not as good. And so that is really the first thing that you have to do. So you have to have examples that students need to compare. And you as a teacher really have to think about what examples are good examples to use. So is there an example that is really a good example of something that always goes wrong.
And the second thing would be that they then discuss with each other what their insights were from comparing those examples. So usually you would do like a think, pair, share, like you show them the examples or the exemplars, and then they'll do some thinking on their own, like what do I notice? And then they'll discuss it with the person sitting next to them, for example. And then you would have a whole class discussion on like what did everybody think? Which one was best? What did you notice? And that discussion is actually quite helpful because that will teach you something that you can't learn on your own. That is that you can have different perspectives on quality. So somebody will think something is good that you might have thought was really bad. So one of the interesting examples is by Shirley Clark, for example. She has this example of like a horror story that like a group of teachers will read. And then, usually people will start arguing with each other because some will think version A is better, while others will say version B is better. And that teaches you a lot, like their thinking about what makes each version good or not good, teaches you a lot about how people perceive quality. So it's actually quite interesting to have that whole classroom discussion. And then because it helps everybody like understand what other points of view might be possible. And then afterwards, you would have like you would summarize that discussion in the form of like a rubric or a list of criteria.
And I think also, especially that the more holistic the goal is that you're working towards, or the more holistic the end product is, the more important the dialogue is that you organize in the classroom, because the dialogue is really crucial to get a better grasp of what all the elements are, or the different perspectives towards, what the quality is and what the good works look like. So the more holistic, the more important the dialogue. I think that's also something that I learned, because just as you said, there can be so many perspectives towards, what we think is beautiful or what we think is a good example of something. So yeah, I can really emphasize.
Yeah, and sometimes it's also not sometimes the standard is also not set in stone. So there's been recent research on sense for quality. There was conducted among first-year students in a chemistry university course, and they had to write lab journals. And one of the things is that a lab journal, like in the field of chemistry, there is no like consensus on what a lab journal should be. So there's not really a standard, but there is like a framework that you could set up. And one of the things they really need to learn, those first-year students, is that, they have to develop a sense for quality, based around function and all those other things. So what they had was they didn't have like a restrictive rubric or a restrictive list of criteria, but they did offer some kind of framework that they could use. But that really needed to be filled with sense for quality. Like if you just have a framework, or you just have a rubric, then that will not be enough to understand what all the different words mean. Like when is something sufficient? When is something good? When is something articulated well? Like that's something that you only learn through comparing and then having a discussion, to really give like meaning to those words.
So we just talked about how you can organize developing a sense for quality when you're working on a product, and how you can use different examples, compare them, talk about it, so you can come to criteria. But there's also something else. Sometimes you want to organize developing a sense for quality when also on the process, and that is a different approach. René, can you tell us a bit more of how you can do that?
Yes. So, you could do sense for quality on making soup, for example, and you could look at the end product and you could compare soups, like what is good soup? And then have like, good exemplars of like a good tomato soup, and then
I'm getting hungry now.
Yeah, quite off. You could really focus on that end product and make sure that your students know, what does quality look like. But then the process matters as well, because how are they going to make that soup? Do they leave a clean kitchen? Do they work, with clean tools?
Are they doing the right steps?
Are you doing the right steps? Doing things in the proper order? Do you have a mise en place where you cut everything beforehand before you start cooking? These are all steps you could take that make for a good process. And usually a good process will help to create a good product. So what you want is, you don't just want your students to have sense for quality on the end product, but you might also want to have students that have a sense for quality in terms of the process, because that's also helpful. When you give feedback, or if you want them to self-regulate more. So what you could do is what you would do is you would model all the steps. And some call it like a think aloud, where you don't just show all the steps, but you also talk about all the decisions you make while going through the process. And you might mention things like, let's say you're making soup, and you just start off at the beginning. You're like, I'm going to make a soup, and I'm going to make a tomato soup, but I don't know how to approach it. Like, I've never made tomato soup before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, Google a recipe, or I'm going to look up a recipe. And then how will I know if it's a good recipe or not? So usually what you will do as a teacher is you're going to show all the steps and do meta talk, as we call it, like where you discuss all the things that are going on in your head. These might be like thinking steps. They also might be emotional things you go through. For example, if you're like doing sports, or when something is very complicated, then you're talking to yourself. And then as a teacher, you might just want to model that as well. Like, I think this is hard and I'm struggling, but now I know, because I'm struggling, that I have to do this and this, or that I can ask for help, for example. So what you just do is you write out all the steps for yourself, and then you make a point, because you have that curse of knowledge, is you make a point out of making explicit what all your thinking steps are. And that's, the hard bit for us as teachers, because, usually our expertise is very like interwoven with each other. So you're doing a lot of things on a subconscious level, but you really have to make it conscious. Like, what am I doing? What am I saying? Why am I doing this? And then to help your students understand what a good process looks like.
What I think is also important to give a bit of more attention is what to do if you have already existing criteria lists, or you have a rubric that you made with your fellow colleagues and you're supposed to use. And of course, there's nothing wrong with already existing criteria lists or existing rubrics, but the same as what we talked about earlier, if you just share them, like you would share your learning goals, if you would just share rubrics or criteria with your students, that's not enough. That's not enough to let your students develop a sense for quality. So what is necessary is that the criteria actually come to life. And it's very wonderful if you have the opportunity that your students can think themselves of what would be the criteria, or if themselves would make a rubric on that follow-ups of the dialogue and comparing the examples, but it's not necessary per se. So what's also good is that if you have a rubric already, or you have existing criteria lists, is that you let your students use them, that you give them an assignment that would say, okay, guys, you're the teacher now. So here are 3 anonymous examples of students of last year who made 3 letters. I wrote a letter for the subject English, and now here is the rubric, and try to assess them. So then also the students have to compare the different examples. They have to talk about it. So there's a dialogue, and they really have to use the criteria with the examples. So the criteria then come to life. And that's also with doing a think aloud. You always have to make sure that the criteria are becoming more clear, that the students really can grasp them better.
So here are some questions to check whether you have understood the episode.
First question. Why is sharing learning goals with your students not enough to let them understand what is expected of them?
What are the different steps of developing a sense for quality by using examples, and why is each step useful?
For what type of learning objective would you use a think aloud?
Thank you for listening. Until the next episode.